Final Fantasy VIII is among the most distinct Final Fantasy games in the anthology for a number of reasons. Its departure from the JRPG conventions that had been established in previous games, from mechanics through to setting, has made it a talking point for many, for good or ill, and yet, beyond that, it also holds a certain esteem for being one of the most wildly speculated upon games in terms of story and character. So why does Final Fantasy VIII have such insane theories attributed to it? Where do ideas, such as Squall is dead and Rinoa being Ultimecia, come from, and how much stock should be put into theories that have snowballed through online discourse but have only the sparsest evidence in the actual game? Well, beginning at the beginning, there's a few reasons that Final Fantasy VIII accounts for the broadest array of theories in popular discourse. The first being that the story is split over different time periods of past, present and future, and there's a distinct undercurrent of cause and effect between these time frames, particularly the first two, with chronological gaps in between that leave room for interpretation. Likewise, we have an ensemble cast of characters who, unlike previous Final Fantasy games, aren't explored equally. So for example, we have Squall, the hero, being the most thoroughly explored, and indeed one of the first, if not the first, Final Fantasy hero to have a first-person internal monologue in the series. And then by comparison we have this ripple effect of characters that support and orbit him, such as Zell, Selphie, Quistis, Rinoa and so on. The second reason is that not only is the writing consciously more subtle in how it hints at certain events, connections between characters, and the causal effects of time in this game, but from a production viewpoint, writers Kazushige Najima and Yoshinori Katase have stated how up to 50% of this story got cut for the game, primarily the past events that feature the deuteragonist Laguna Loire, which many audiences also cite as part of the reason for ambiguities in the game events, game story, unless you're really being attentive to it. So what's all of this got to do with fan theories? Well, simply put, I think just as nature abhors a vacuum, so do human beings abhor ambiguity, particularly in our storytelling. How many times have we seen unclear endings in film and TV inundate forums with questions from fans such as, is Walter White dead? Does Tony Soprano get whacked? Is Deckard a replicant? And so on. It's this need for clarity and difficulty in accepting the inconclusive or the absurd that provokes audiences to fill in the gaps themselves and create fan theories. Turning to Final Fantasy VIII, there is plenty to speculate on, owing to the preoccupation with Squall's story arc above all else. What happens to the Galbadian military at the end of the game? Where do Alone's powers come from? What's the deal with Griever? And so on. Indeed, a personal favourite of mine that I had speculated upon myself, and then upon searching about it I found it had been discussed online, and this is the suggestion that the character of Irvine is actually aligned to the interests of General Caraway's faction of Galbadia, because, of course, why was Irvine serendipitously chosen as the team's sniper? Why does he take direct orders from General Caraway to rescue Rinoa if he's allegiant to Garden? How did he evade capture from Adia's assassination attempt? And how did he magically gain access to the prison unless he was being handled by someone high up in the Galbadian chain of command? So there's many instances of micro scenarios like this that, as fans, if we were to pay attention to them, can sort of sprawl out and make us develop our own theories. And many of them have a subtle but plausible enough basis to provoke further thoughts, further theories, and so on. And another great example, I think, is Seifer Almasi and his dream to become a sorceress's knight, which stems from Laguna Loire. And if we pay attention to this thread, we have the fourth Laguna dream, which is one of the weirdest ones. It seems like the most unnecessary one, where we see him starring in a movie as a sorceress's knight to try and make some money. And while most Laguna dreams progress the secondary story with Alone to some degree or another, this one feels a bit random, aside from showing us the lunatic Pandora at the end. But what it does in fact do is serve to show or hint at Seifer's future inspiration to become a sorceress's knight, this romantic dream, as he calls it, and is very sparingly hinted at through the fact that Seifer and Laguna have the exact same gunblade stance, this one-handed sort of fencing style, and of course the fact that Seifer harbours this dream to be a knight and protect a sorceress, which is precisely what Laguna's role in that film is. And there's plenty of little threads like this in Final Fantasy VIII, and again, probably the most famous one is the unspoken but clearly nodded at fact of Laguna being Squall's father. So, looking at the two major theories of the game, let's look first at the Rinoa-Ultimecia theory. All of this subtle narrative stuff that I'm hinting at is important because what it does is it makes people start clutching at straws for other subtleties that may or may not be in the game, which is understandable because they are trying to tie the story together more neatly in their own minds. And after the revelation that Seifer's inspired by Laguna, or Laguna is Squall's father, or Julia being Rinoa's mother, we start trying to make links between other characters that appear through this story. And Ultimecia is an important one, because most Final Fantasy villains have some sort of connection to the current or past events of the game. More often than not, they have some prior history or connection with the hero character that loops them in, not just to the conclusion of the macro story, but also the conclusion of the hero's personal arc as well. So Cloud Strife's historic and genetic ties to Sephiroth, Cecil's fraternity to Golbez, Jecht and Tidus being father and son. The list goes on through the Final Fantasy games. Yet, Sorceress Ultimecia doesn't really have a tangible connection or personal history with Squall, and so the escalation towards the endgame arguably lacked the weight that we've come to expect from Final Fantasy sagas, and Squall's mission fulfills the macro arc, but arguably lacks this personal reckoning. Now, personally, I think the writers sought to smooth this out in two key ways. Firstly, we had Squall's personal vendetta / weird bromance with Seifer, which he wrestled with through the first half of the game. And secondly, we have the party's adoptive mother, Adia, who was presented as a red herring antagonist in the first half of the game as well. So both of these characters had that personal history and that emotive dilemma going on with Squall, and indeed the wider party to an extent. But once we get the Ultimecia reveal, ambiguity emerges, the player's desire for cohesion emerges, and thus we eventually arrive at a point where the Rinoa-Ultimecia fan theory takes hold, because breaking it down, what does this theory ultimately do? It makes Final Fantasy VIII a much more tragic game, yes, but ultimately it loops Ultimecia back in with Squall's arc. It squares the circle of the macro and the personal stories being fulfilled at this single endpoint of the game, and it removes that ambiguity that so many people hate when it comes to storytelling. As for the pros and cons of this theory, I've discussed that at length in my Rinoa character analysis episode. I think it comes from a logical position of fans trying to reconcile the game story, as I've mentioned here. It has plausible points to it, for sure, but also there's the counter-argument that it undermines most of the major themes of Final Fantasy VIII. And if you're interested to check out that Rinoa episode, I'll drop a link to it in the description. Moving on to the Squall is dead theory, this is actually pretty much the opposite of the Rinoa as Ultimecia theory. Somehow over the years it's become framed as a plausible interpretation of the game, but actually it was originally written up in a somewhat cynical way. Indeed, the entire vibe of the original website was someone who didn't particularly like the game and was expressing that in the form of a sort of vaguely amusing fan fiction. But what it does is it does add an extra layer of complexity to Final Fantasy VIII's story. It attempts to explain what is actually quite an organic escalation of plot and structure, though one that does certainly go into more abstract territory as we proceed past Disc 1. And just to recap on the theory for those that don't know it, it proposes that Squall dies at the end of Disc 1, and this is the cutscene where Adia impales him with her bicycle limit break attack, and he miraculously covers in Disc 2 with no wounds, which prompts this theory that the remainder of the game is this surreal dreamscape as he's dying. So it doesn't really account for the Laguna arc, which is one of the most significant elements of the game, if not the most significant element. It doesn't constructively address the Sorceress arc, although it does try to account for some of the more ambiguous things about this game, such as why things are getting so weird. So it's kind of amusing in a similar way to the Rinoa-Ultimecia theory. It's attempting to account for some of the more ambiguous and wild elements of Final Fantasy VIII, but rather than squaring the circle or confirming ambiguities, it simply has that shock value of suggesting that our hero died very early in the game, and the rest of it is nonsense. So, in all, Final Fantasy VIII plays host to some of the wildest fan theories because it offers scope for interpretation, and encourages it through its already subtly written and tenuously linked up characters. Things like Seifer's connection to Laguna, or his untapped relationship with Rinoa. It's led to other readings and suggestions of these sorts of characters, such as Headmaster Cid's leniency towards Seifer, making some fans suggest that maybe they are related somehow, and things like this. And ultimately, I think Final Fantasy VIII is intriguing as much as by what is not shown as by what is, and it's in that ambiguity and the unclarified events between past, present and future, between character actions and intentions, that fans have taken it upon themselves to fill the void with variously wild and weird speculations.